Less than 24 hours ago, Pope Leo XIV wrote a sentence that seemed to carry nothing extraordinary, and yet it began to ignite hearts that had long seemed asleep. What it said was simple, at the service of the truth. That was all, no signature, no ceremony, no solemn proclamation. And yet, while the world carried on, distracted by headlines on politics and economics, heaven within the church began to stir. There were no official announcements, no cameras rolling, no press conferences, just a subtle memorandum, delivered before dawn to the dicasteries of the Roman Curia, containing direct instructions about a new mandatory course in every seminary in the world. It wasn't about pastoral care, or sociology, or modern structures of inclusion. It was about doctrine, clear doctrine, doctrine as a spiritual discipline, doctrine as nourishment for starving souls. And then, just hours later, the silent thunder struck. Robert Sarah had been appointed Secretary of State. On the surface, nothing changed, but in the invisible foundations of the church, everything began to tremble. Those who expected continuity realized this new pontificate would not simply be an extension of the last, and those who expected radical ruptures were faced with something even more unsettling. Leo wasn't destroying anything. He was remembering. It wasn't a war, it was a surgery. And Sarah, whose soul had been forged in Guinea and in the silent reading of St. John of the Cross, was not a politician. He was a monk. No fiery speeches, no hidden agendas, no hollow slogans, just gestures, just clarity. In times when even within the church there is fear of speaking with precision, Leo spoke a direction, and Sarah was his first response. And if something about this stirs you, something you may not know how to name, but recognize in the depths of your heart, write in the comments, "Truth is my anchor." That way, this message can reach more people who, like you, feel that faith needs deeper roots than the empty words of modernity. The reaction was immediate. A seminarian in Nairobi wrote, "I've never heard of him before, but I already feel like he's speaking for us." A catechist in the Philippines posted, "If the center teaches with clarity again, the margins will begin to listen." A theology professor in Boston, surprised by the impact, confessed in class, "This isn't just a curricular change, it's an institutional conversion." And in Rome, where tension is measured in whispers, the name Sarah began to circulate with an unsettling intensity. But Sarah did not defend himself. He gave no interviews. In his first homily after the appointment, he said only, "Truth is not a burden, it is a bridge." And then he fell silent. Because in times like ours, silence is more subversive than shouting. And perhaps that's why he was chosen, because he understands that clarity is not the opposite of charity, it is its most courageous form. And between the lines of this gesture, the Catholic world began to awaken, not with noise, but with prayer. In Bogota, a bishop began rewriting the formation curriculum for priests. In Manila, a group of lay people began weekly meetings to study doctrine as nourishment for the soul. In Krakow, the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas were read again, as if they were breaking news, not because tradition had become trendy, but because the Catholic heart was tired of guessing. Leo XIV knew the church didn't need more adaptations. It needed an axis, and an axis is not shouted. It is planted. And Robert Sarah, with his humble firmness, became that axis. A European cardinal murmured, "He's too rigid for Rome." Another replied, "But maybe that's exactly what Rome needs." A bishop in Africa, upon hearing the news, simply said, "Finally," and while the newspapers ignored it, and the blogs speculated, something deeper was happening. The church, for the first time in decades, seemed to be remembering who she is, not to isolate herself but to find herself again, not to fight the world but to speak to it without losing her voice. And that's why it all began with such a short sentence, "At the service of the truth." If that sentence also feels like it carries the weight of eternity, subscribe to this channel and light a candle with us against the darkness, because here, every gesture has a soul, every silence has a voice, and every video is a flame that refuses to die. And we haven't even begun to see what comes next. Sure, here is the English translation you requested, and then, like a candle that insists on burning amidst the wind, the news continued to spread, not as a headline but as a whisper, not through official channels but through inflamed hearts. In Nairobi, a seminarian wrote to his rector, "Finally, we are being taken seriously." In Buenos Aires, a nun remarked to another in the dining hall, "This silence is saying what no one else dared to say." And in Germany, amid faculties where theological ambiguity had become a comfort, professors began to gather in secret, in doubt, on alert. But the Vatican remained silent. Leo XIV gave no interviews. Sarah published no manifestos. It was not necessary, because the language they were using was not that of politics. It was that of fidelity. A new document, brief, like the first, was delivered to the episcopal conferences. It contained no threats, no sanctions, only a request that each bishop write, within 3 months, a confidential report on zones of doctrinal ambiguity in his diocese. Only that, but everyone understood what it meant. It was not a witch hunt. It was a call to lucidity. The church, so accustomed to walking cautiously, suddenly perceived that something older was returning, not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. And the face of this return was Sarah, the African cardinal who for years was seen as peripheral, now carried the torch in the heart of Rome. In a private audience, Leo looked at him and said, "Robert, the world is tired of echoes. The church needs to be a voice." Sarah nodded, his eyes fixed on a crucifix hanging on the wall, and replied, "They had no books, Holy Father, but they had the truth, and that was enough." Leo didn't need to say more. He knew he had found an ally not in strategy, but in mission. And if you too are tired of a diluted faith, where every phrase is a careful step not to displease, leave in the comments. Clarity is charity. That way, more souls can be touched by this truth that does not shout, but whispers. Behind the scenes, some voices began to be disturbed. A European theologian wrote, "We are regressing to the 19th century. A German bishop protested, "Rigidity is the death of dialogue." But Sarah responded as he always did, with gestures. He organized a retreat for bishops in Assisi. He gathered them not to impose, but to remind, and said only, "We are not here to condemn, we are here to remember who we are." In the final homily, in a chapel where the marble was chipped and the candles had been burning since dawn, Sarah spoke like a shepherd. The church does not speak to win, it speaks to save. And in that silence, some realized they were not facing an inquisitor, but a man who had learned from suffering that clarity can heal where noise only wounds. Gradually, the peripheries began to respond. In Uganda, a group of catechists founded the movement, Voice of Truth. In Sao Paulo, seminaries rescued forgotten manuals of doctrine and began to teach as if they truly believed what they said. In Manila, young lay people gathered to study the Veritas Caritate, the small document that had unleashed everything, and found in it a compass. Meanwhile, in Rome, an image circulated on the faithful's cell phones, Leo XIV beside Sarah, both with their eyes turned toward the altar, while a widow lit candles behind them. It was a common liturgy in a forgotten church, but there, something extraordinary had happened. There were no trumpets, no celebration, but there was truth. And where there is truth, there is a beginning. A seminarian who witnessed that moment wrote in his notebook, "We are no longer inventing, we are remembering." And this remembrance, sustained by a living liturgy in hearts that still know how to kneel, began to cross continents. But not everyone received it with peace. In Paris, Louvain, Frankfurt, articles began to appear. Theologians warned about a return to rigidity, about a silent liturgical purge. One of them wrote, "They are building a church of museums, not of mission." But Leo did not respond. Sarah, neither, because they knew the truth does not need to be explained. It only needs to be lived. And in every place where faith seemed asleep, a small flame began to awaken. In Kampala, a bishop declared, "Sarah gave us a compass." In Bogota, a seminarian said, "We no longer need to guess what the church believes." And in Germany, even amid protests, the catechism began to be read again. But something still needed to be said, not in words, but in living flesh, in story. Because while Rome remained silent, the spiritual world began to speak louder. In the Holy Land, an elderly monk wrote in his diary, "This gesture was not only Roman, it was eschatological." In New York, a young priest, until then torn between fidelity and fear of judgment, stood before his parish and said, "From today on, we will speak the whole truth, because truth saves." And then something almost imperceptible to the hurried eyes of the world happened, but unforgettable to those who watch in spirit. In the confessionals, the lines began to grow, not out of guilt, but out of thirst. At masses, the silence after the consecration grew heavier, as if the altar had drawn closer to heaven. In anonymous homes, old Bibles were reopened, and in Catholic schools, teachers who for years had taught in fear began to teach with faith. It was not a reform in the technical sense. It was a reform in the depths, where the soul meets eternity, because by restoring clarity to the church, Leo and Sarah did not just deliver rules, they delivered breath. The oxygen of tradition began to circulate again in the tired lungs of a gasping church. And like every profound truth, it does not come with a manual, it comes with a cross. Because clarity, when real wounds before it heals, it expels the comfort of ambiguity. It reveals what is rotten beneath the layers of politeness. That is why the most veiled resistances also began not only in the academies, but in the hearts that had grown used to lukewarmness. But here is where the true boldness of Pope Leo XIV is understood. He does not want a church bright on the outside and empty on the inside. He does not want applause nor headlines. He wants souls. He wants salvation. And that is why he called Sarah, not to impose, but to protect, not to harden, but to purify. In a private meeting with a group of young catechists, Sarah said simply, "The soul of the church is at the altar. If the altar is strong, the whole body resists." These words became a poster in Manila, a sticker on cars in Lagos, graffiti on discreet walls in Marseille. The phrase went viral not because it was modern, but because it is eternal. And you who have listened until now may be feeling what many in silence are feeling, that something has been touched, that a restoration has begun, not with decrees, but with courage, not with visible reforms, but with interior conversions. And perhaps this is the moment to take a step. So, If this message touched your soul, comment now. Awake, church. That way, more hearts can be reached. Share this video with 5 people of faith. Light this candle. Spread this hope. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, discourses, do so now. Here, every word carries weight. Every silence has intention. Every video is a candle lit in the darkness of the world. May the Holy Spirit guide you, and may truth finally be loved again. You may not have heard this story in the headlines, but if you've come this far, it is because your soul senses that something is changing. It is not spectacle, it is foundation. It is not control, it is identity. And if you feel this truth is yours too, share this video with someone you love, because maybe now God is using this content to kindle a flame you didn't even know was still alive. See you in the next video. And until then, may truth guide you, sustain you, and transform you.